is I'd rather take what Brad said earlier about how our society makes promiscuity and impurity normal. I want to take that concept and, using logic, blow holes in all of the things that society tries to tell us. Because I believe, and I assume most of you guys believe, that what the church teaches on purity is correct. Society obviously is telling us a very different story. So somebody's got to be wrong. And I think if you use logic to look at what society tries to tell us, it's easy to see that society is the one full of lies. And so I'm going to approach it kind of like a philosopher would and just point out first what society tells us and then look at it logically. And I think we'll see that what society tells us therefore is not correct. So just to piggyback off what Brad said a little bit, society does make impurity the norm, whether it's the music we hear or movies or anything. The idea that sex is just a casual, fun thing to do is crammed down our throats. So I assume, people that grow up in our culture tend to kind of think, yeah, we know the church teaches that this is not really what you should do, but not really that big of a deal because everybody else does it anyway. I'm not gonna lose any sleep over it. Anybody in here want to make a moral argument to me that we could go to Africa and capture a human being and treat them as a slave? Because at one time in our society in this country, that was considered normal. Everybody did it. But the fact that that happened did not make it any more or less right than what it truly was. Fads and norms come and go all the time. Behind that always is truth that does not change. And so slavery was never good, even though our society said it was. I'm pointing this out just to make the point that just because our society treats sex like it's not a big deal does not necessarily make it true. And I think that's an important distinction to have, since we tend to measure everything by what we're used to. I'm making the point that what you're used to is not necessarily a good thing to measure anything by, because most people don't really have a whole lot of independent thought. Most people just do what the crowd says to do, they do what everybody else does, and they never really process anything on their own and try to figure out what they think about it. Therefore, I argue that following the mob, following the crowd, groupthink, mob mentality, all of that is unproductive and foolish and even cowardly. I advocate thinking for yourself. So now that we've established that what society says does not necessarily have any impact on truth and morality, I think we can move on a little bit and take each one of the things that society tells us and try to figure out if they're correct or not. So one thing that mob mentality is all about is it says that sex can be separated from love. You hear this in conversations at Friends with Benefits, pornography, all this kind of stuff that pretends that you can have the physical part of it without there being anything else tied to it. I say that is a lie. If any of you were on the spring retreat and you heard about theology of the body, one of the things we spend a lot of time talking about is how the love of a man and a woman coming together creates life. And that's the point. That's kind of the same way of God and the Trinity creating life, and God through love creating human life. That's always an important component of it. That kind of love, the ultimate end of it, is the creation of life. And we already know that people who are trying to have casual sex and all that don't want the full experience of it, because we know it's pretty common to use contraception. Nobody wants to get pregnant. You're going to have sex and not have any consequences from it. So we already know that people that are treating it like that are intentionally not wanting the full expression of what this is all about. So it's not too surprising to learn that they also then, just like they don't want the life part of it, they probably don't really want the love part of it either. But you have to intentionally work to eliminate those things from it, because the standard default position is that they all go together and cannot be separated. I think that's a logical position, and therefore I think it's false to say that those things can be separated. Another thing that the crowd tells us, that society tells us, is this concept of if it feels good, do it. And it's another one of those it's not really a big deal things, and you only live for so long, you might as well have a good time. It makes some sense to say it, but again, I think we can blow holes in that kind of logic because it's not really logical at all. First of all, ask somebody who's a recovering alcoholic if they would adhere to the idea of if it feels good, do it. A recovering alcoholic is somebody who probably wants to drink all the time, but is at least trying to make a conscious decision to ignore those impulses and make a different decision. And that's because what we seem to want in any individual moment is not always commensurate with who we want to be ultimately, right? So that means we can all have temptations in a moment, but if we acted on every one of those, we probably would not be the men that we wanted to be. And that leads to severe disappointment, and generally it undignifies our humanity. And that's generally what's going to happen anytime you simply act on carnal impulses, is your dignity is gone. Because what separates us from the animals is God gave men the glory and the beauty of being able to think for themselves. We don't just act according to instinct like the animals do. We act according to higher thinking. We evaluate who we want to be, who we need to be, what are we called to. And because we're called to something higher, we don't rely only on carnal impulses to make decisions. If we do, we cease to be men at all, and we're animals. And there's no dignity. Another way to point out that there's no dignity in acting on carnal impulses, I was just at Starbucks before I came here tonight, and I heard two ladies talking beside me, and they were talking about two guys they know, and they were laughing, and it was a funny story, but they were talking about how these guys have a pact with each other, so that they each have each other's keys to their apartment. And if one of them ever dies, the other one is responsible for going to their apartment, getting all the porn out, and getting rid of it, so that their families won't ever know that they were doing it. And I was listening to that, and I laughed a little bit, but then I thought, well, that really says a lot, because these guys are making an entire lifestyle out of this, and yet they're so ashamed of it, really, they wouldn't even want their families to know they do it. Again, I argue that it is not possible to have any dignity for yourself if you're actively having no self-discipline and engaging in things that would make you embarrassed for your family to discover. It's not about getting caught and getting in trouble. These guys had their own apartments. It was an embarrassment. If you're doing things that embarrass you in front of others, you cannot be dignified while doing it. Because what you're proving to yourself is that you have no self-discipline, you have no self-strength, and you have no dignity. And I think that's an important distinction too. Another thing the mob will tell us, that society tries to get us to believe, is that there is some idea of masculinity if you sleep around. You hear this a lot of times with guys counting up how many girls they've slept with, you know, like it's a trophy to see who wins, stuff like that. So it's very prevalent. I would argue that that's actually not a masculine form of behavior at all, and it's actually very cowardly. For one thing, men are defined by strength, and we just talked about how you cannot exhibit no self-control and show yourself to have any dignity and strength. So if you're trying to prove that you're a man by saying you act on every carnal impulse you have, I would argue, no, that's actually not a man at all, that's a beast. Men have control over themselves, and they do have the ability to make better decisions than that. I would also encourage any of you to talk to the girls you know and ask them if they would call you masculine for sleeping around with other human beings. And again, what I'm trying to get you guys to do is I'm not encouraging you to behave a certain way. You guys do whatever you want. It's your decision, it's your thing. What I'm trying to make the point of is that don't lie to me and don't lie to yourselves about what these things are. Don't say it's masculine when it's not. Don't say it's dignified when it's not. In other words, you've got to make your own decisions, but the path of stones is to acknowledge what these things actually are. They are not dignified and they are not masculine. So to kind of tie all this together then, the logic is flawed because we can see that what society is trying to tell us is that by behaving like an animal, by having no self-dignity, no self-respect, by objectifying women, by turning your back on love and instead accepting personal selfish pleasure, by doing all of those things, that's the key to living a fulfilled life. And I know a lot of people who have given that a shot, and they don't really feel that fulfilled. With guys, it might even be a little bit different. I know for a fact that girls, the more they do that kind of stuff, the worse they feel about themselves. And it becomes kind of like a drug. They keep sleeping around and doing whatever to get accepted by others, but they have no personal respect. They have no personal integrity. They give it all away. It does not lead to a life of dignity. So I just want you to remember that your actions reflect everything. They reflect your personal character. They reflect your self-discipline or your lack of self-discipline. They reflect your faith, your God, your parents, your friends. They reflect you, the people that are in the church with you. And so I think that's an important thing to remember. So again, if you take anything from this, just remember the key to what I'm trying to say. And any of you can argue with me on any of this later if you want. I've made an argument that there is no logic in what society tells us. And I think I did a pretty good job of blowing holes in their arguments. If anybody wants to argue with me, I will address that. But for now, I just encourage you to remember that since we've blown holes in that logic, that it is not possible for you to consider yourselves dignified or masculine or any of that stuff if you choose to have yourself that way. So DJ is going to talk a little bit more about how we can actually live this kind of life.
Okay, so obviously, like as Jonathan was saying, we all know that we're called to live a life of purity, and for most of us, we know what that entails. Like we know how we can live a life of purity. But why is that so hard to do? Well, living a pure life is obviously not the cool or secular choice. Like it's not what our society is telling us, and that's what Jonathan was just talking about. Society exposes us to a lot of different propaganda via movies, television, music, and these forms teach us that it's not really necessary to live purely. It's actually telling us exactly the opposite. Crude humor, naked women, sex scenes, those are almost the norm in any movie above PG like these days. And in these movies, it's like expected that that's going to happen. Like we know that when we go see the movies that like those things are going to be there. Yet how often do we see like naked men in the same movies? It's not there because that's not the societal standard for women. So film directors and producers often cater to their demographics. They know that like men want to see that in the movies, and they put it in there to like cater to that so they can be successful. Whereas like women aren't necessarily as interested in that aspect of it, so they're not going to put that in there so they see that. We also see the same thing in music. What we consider our popular music is always telling us to go on and like drink, smoke, have sex, like just live life, like don't like care what anyone thinks. I picked out like one random song that like one of my roommates was playing as I was writing this, and it was like a song by Pitbull called "Give Me Everything," and it says like, "Tonight I will love you tonight, give me everything tonight. For all we know, we might not get tomorrow. Let's do it tonight." So it's just saying like, oh, who cares? Like we might not be here tomorrow, so let's just like go on and have sex, like have a good time, because who knows? Like tomorrow maybe we won't be here, so just who cares? And like that's like what our society like advocates for, is like non-committal, like just short-term hookups, just because. And a lot of people might say like, oh, well that's just music, like it's just a song, who cares? But our music is a symbol of like what we believe. Like it becomes like, it reflects the values that are important to us. So I mean, if we're listening to that and supporting that, like obviously that's like going to continue to be the norm in our pop culture because that's what we like, and that's kind of subsequently how we live as well. Also like TV kind of shows the same thing that Jonathan was saying. Like also like my roommates are really into Modern Family. Like it's telling us like, oh, like who really cares? Like basically like that's just how our society has evolved. But we've already kind of like broke down the barriers of saying what society tells us doesn't necessarily make it more right. And the fact of the matter is that living a pure life is your choice. The church gives us a lot of guidelines that tell us how we can live a life of sexual purity, but at the end of the day, you have to make that choice for yourself. No one's going to sit there and force you to do it, and if they do, it's not going to work anyways. When I was in high school, a lot of my friends were very different from me, and a lot of them were struggling to find God in their life. A lot of the kids in my classes were like atheists, and we were really good friends still, like we got along. But they were pretty outspoken about their views of like how they struggle to know God. But regardless of that, they still don't drink, don't smoke, don't have sex. Like they're still living pure lives even without, with the absence of God in their life. So that's just an example of how, yeah, like we can use the church to lead us to sexual purity, but it's still your choice. Like ultimately, you're making the choice of how to live, and you can still do that even without the church, although it's obviously going to be a lot harder. It's not necessarily about being Catholic, it's about surrounding yourself with people that are going to help lead you to Christ through their actions. And if you're surrounding yourself with people who are living pure lives, obviously it's going to be a lot easier for you yourself to live a pure life than it is if you're surrounding yourself with people who aren't doing that. In my own life, I've seen the way that living an impure life can damage hearts, friendships, self-esteems, and souls. Relationships centered in sexual activity can damage hearts and friendships, but masturbation and pornography are just as problematic, and as like sexual activity. A few statistics on pornography before we move on. In 2006, the worldwide pornography industry's estimated revenue was $97 billion in the world. Obviously, I think Brad had a stat that was like a lot lower than that, and I was talking to Jonathan about it, and we think it's probably gone down a lot just because of like the way the internet's evolved, and like you don't actually have to pay for pornography anymore. But it's just as prevalent. Like pornography is not going away; it's just becoming free. So it's actually more people are probably getting access to it. But in 2006, that meant that those revenues were larger than all of the top technology companies combined: Microsoft, Google, Amazon, eBay, Yahoo, Apple, Netflix, and Earthlink. So this like industry, like we associate like technology as like, oh yeah, that's the biggest thing, like that's what makes money, and it does. But like pornography is like right up there with that, like as one of the top industries, and we never hear about it. Like no one's ever pointing out the negatives in that. Like we kind of just sugarcoat it and move right over it. And also something I found interesting, children aged 12 to 17 are the largest group of consumers of online pornography. And this is the group that we're trying to like hide this stuff from. Like it's not legal to view pornography if you're under 18. We're trying to hide it from them, yet they're the ones that are getting access to it the most. So I mean, it's something that is ingrained in our culture that's just really ridiculous. The selfish acts of masturbation and pornography give us this instant gratification, though, that's literally at our fingertips, and it's harmful to our long-term development as humans. Pornography trains our minds to expect things that aren't even real. I don't know if you know this, but pornographic images aren't even real. Like, they're often touched up to give models bigger breasts, perfect skin, like, take away this blemish. And these fake images resonate in our mind, and they change the way that we look at women. We tend to look at women more lustfully rather than with love. And when this happens, the women that we see in our everyday lives, like the ones that are right there, can't even compete with these people that we're looking at on the computer because they're not real. Like, the people on the computer are not real. So that's just kind of making these perfect like images on the computer that you're never going to see in real life. Also, an interesting fact that I came across yesterday, the chemical reaction in your brain that causes porn addiction is also the same chemical reaction that occurs when you become addicted to cocaine and heroin. So, I mean, that's pretty serious stuff. Like, obviously, like, viewing these images can become an addiction really easily, and that's something that, I mean, we all know how bad cocaine and heroin is, but how often do we sit around and talk about, like, how pornography is affecting someone's life? This is something, like, this is tough stuff, and people, like, we've all failed at it, and we're going to fail. Like, that's inevitable. But you're not alone, and you can still mold yourself into the person that you want to be. The theme of the year, like we've been talking about all year, is like all things new. And we know that through God, like, we can be made into something new. For a long time, like, in my life, when I was, like, younger and, like, having jobs, I was around a lot of people that were into this, like, born-again phenomena that was, like, happening, like, 5 years ago maybe, where it was like, oh, like, I'm born-again Christian, I'm born-again virgin, I'm born-again this, born-again that. And I was kind of like, how stupid is that? Like, what kind of cop-out is this? Like, oh, like, I'm not a virgin, but I'll just be a born-again virgin because I can. But, like, if you really think about it, like, you are able to, like, be led to Christ and be made new, like, through Christ, and, like, it is something that you can use. John chapter 3, verse 3 states, Jesus answered and said to him, Amen, amen, I say to you, no one can see the kingdom of God without being born from above. So, I mean, we're going to fail, it's inevitable, but the bigger issue is how are we going to respond to our failure? Do we continually fall into the same traps, or are we going to change and make a difference? Are we going to offer up our brokenness to God in prayer, or are we just going to try and do it alone? Because we can't be embarrassed about the struggles that we have as men and that we encounter with sexual impurity. Rather, we need to offer these struggles up to God so He can help make us new. And that's, like, kind of what this whole night's about. It's not about just, like, sitting here and, like, listening to Jonathan and I talk and being like, okay, like, I get it, but whatever, like, this is about me, and, like, it's, like, a personal thing. Or I hear what you're saying, but I don't struggle with this. Like, kind of, like, lying to yourself about things that are going on. Because, to be honest, like, if you're not going to be able to sit down and have a conversation about it and, like, work towards it, then the healing's never going to occur. Like, the problems are going to be there over and over, time and time again, because you're not dealing with them. You're just kind of brushing them under the rug and moving on. So we also came up with a few, like, practical ways to, like, help begin the healing process to living a more moral life. So one of them is just removing all sources of temptation that may prevent you from healing and remaining sexually pure. So whether that be you need to shut your phone off at a certain time of the day, or like take the computer out of your room. These things are going to help you to move in the right direction. Matthew chapter 5, verse 29 through 30 states, "If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than to have your whole body thrown into Gehenna. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into Gehenna." So I mean, it's not bad to like say, all right, I know I'm going to struggle, so taking steps to go ahead and prevent that. That's something that would actually be a very good thing. Finding people to help you through the healing process, like we have like a great support system here at St. Gertrude's and like other friends that you have in your lives. So talk to people and make them hold you accountable, like hold each other accountable and move on so that way you can grow in your holiness and you can work to alleviate your struggles. One of the ways you could do this is through daily prayer. Commit yourself to daily prayer, praying for your struggles. If you're struggling with something, like offer that up to God. Don't just sit there and like keep it to yourself. Like if you're really struggling, like talk to God about it and work to correct the problem, not just sit there and leave it going. One of the best ways you could do that is through adoration. I was talking to Brad the other day, and he was like saying that he heard that through adoration, like you can actually have these pornographic images burned out of your mind. And we had like a conversation about it, which was really interesting because seeing Jesus through the Blessed Sacrament, like if you're staring at his body, okay, like you're adoring his body, not these images that we're seeing on the computer. So, I mean, if we're sitting there staring at Jesus, that's something that can actually like undo those pornographic images in our mind and help us to like live more like Jesus, which I think is really cool. One of the ones that I came up with is turn lustful thoughts into a prayerful moment. So if you know that you're starting to like get tempted to like view pornography or something, like stop for a minute and think like, and pray for those people that you're going to start objectifying. Like be like, you know what, like I'm not going to do this, like, and pray for them, because that's like one of the most powerful things. If you could start realizing what you're doing before you're doing it, I think it's a really powerful thing. A lot of us like will fall into these traps and we'll feel super guilty afterwards. But if we can start feeling guilty before we do it, that's how you can actually stop and work towards living a more pure life. Partake in the sacraments. We're going to have confession available later today, and Brad will talk about that later. Like, go to confession and actually seek healing. Receive the Eucharist. The Catechism of the Catholic Church states that Holy Communion separates us from sin. For this reason, the Eucharist cannot unite us to Christ without at the same time cleansing us from past sins and preserving us from future sin. Likewise, reception of the sacrament of reconciliation must be a continual part of the recovery process, as often as it is needed, so that the Eucharist may indeed preserve us from future mortal sins. So I don't know if you guys realize this, but like when you look at pornography and like masturbate, like that is a mortal sin. And like a lot of times we kind of like brush that under the rug, like, oh, it's not a big deal. Well, it is a big deal. Like it is something that needs to be addressed. And then just reminding yourself of God's presence, like we talked about on retreat, like setting up a prayer space in your room, like wear a crucifix or a medal or some kind of like bracelet to help remind you of God, so that way when you get tempted, you can kind of like remember that stuff. And that kind of leads into the angelic warfare confraternity that like we talked about last semester with Father Ezra. Like that's another way that you can kind of like, I mean, the whole confraternity is centered around purity, yet it's just like saying a prayer for purity every day to St. Thomas Aquinas, and just wearing a medal to kind of remind you of that. And I think we're going to have another enrollment like this semester, right? So like if that's something you haven't done yet, like go ahead and try and get involved with that if that's something you need. If you are already involved in it and aren't like faithfully praying the prayers or like we're in the middle, try that so that way you can see if that works in your life. Because again, this is all about like addressing the problem and kind of moving forward. And if we can do that, then hopefully we're going to be able to live